So welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is John and I's session on managing the coming up OT security regulatory requirements. So the two of us today, John Livingston, our CEO, he's also on the line there. He's 20 years at McKinsey. He's been at 5 years with Verve. Lots of experience, all sorts of over several domains and working with customers all over the world. And then myself, I'm Ron Brash, Director of Cybersecurity Insights at Verve. Over 15 years of experience, just particularly in building embedded systems and doing assessments. And my focus is really on device vulnerability research. But Verve Industrial Protection is much more than just John and I. It's a company that's got its roots actually from a systems integrator perspective. So we've been helping build over 25 years and doing deployments for large DCSs and doing integrations for any number of DCS vendors or PLC vendors. Among that, though, we're a large team of both IT and OT engineers and experts. And we spent over 15 years deploying our endpoint security compliance management platform across many industries across the world. And we have dozens of clients across all sectors. So not only just we produce a product, we also have professional services to go along with it. So through all that knowledge, though, it brings us to one of the big standpoints, which is about compliance. Many of our customers have that pain or have that reality. So our session today is going to be roughly in 4 different areas. I'm going to start, obviously, with introducing the cybersecurity risk part to it and how that's actually becoming a larger and larger operational reliability type threat. But this is going to set the stage to why we're going to talk about compliance. And compliance isn't just the rubber stamping that you go deal with when you go get your driver's license. It's much more. So if you've seen some of my other sessions, you know that I like to focus on this type of page to begin my sessions. If you look across, starting roughly year 2000, if we exclude some of the one-off ICS incidences, the large-scale, high-impact ICS events in terms of an actual PLC or an embedded system being attacked is very rare. And when you say that, you look at across here, there's some odd 18 or 16 or so events, they're still relatively rare. There's various reasons for that, but when you start to look at the upcoming paces, things are starting to change. So starting in 2000, we had Marucci Shire, which is an insider threat. Then you had, of course, the infamous Stuxnet, and someone can ring the bell for me. Then you can go towards David Bessie and Nuclear with Slammerworm, and you can go all the way, fast forwarding to now, to Trisis, SolarWinds, Norsk Hydro, Oldsmar Water. But what's changed, though, is something on a slightly different case. If you've looked within the last 3 months, or even within the last 8 to 10 months between 2020 and 2021, large high-impact events are becoming common. These aren't the ones that are the Trisises or the Stuxnets. These are attacks that are being introduced to environments through a number of vectors that should have been closed, should have been managed, but for whatever reason, they're not. So these are the ransomware type incidences that are affecting Molson Coors, WestRock, Colonial, GBS Meats, Fujifilm, Boston Ferries, you name it, they're probably in there at some point, even if it maybe never met the news. So those type of ransomware attacks are going up because the barrier to entry for a malicious party is very low. And largely, and you'll see what the result of that will be, is what the change is going to be, it's compliance. Compliance is going to be the result for all of those oopses. But if we look at kind of at least from the reported attack side, now there's no data yet for 2021, and I'm sure it's not going to look very wonderful at times, but finance is continuing to dominate across the main domains here. And then if you look at who's been kind of shuffling around, manufacturing and energy went from 8th or 9th place out of all of the domains and shot up to the 2nd or 3rd most targeted industries. Again, transportation went down, probably likely because the airlines aren't so profitable. No one really wonders what's going on there. But when we do see a return to a post-COVID era, we're going to probably see that also shoot up again in terms of becoming a targeted attack organization or a targeted attack surface. So again, OT is clearly in the crosshairs, and there's a reason for that. But again, if we just look at manufacturing alone, this is some stats over 2020. There's several organizations here, but 8 of these 9 attacks caused physical shutdowns that impacted multiple plants simultaneously. There's various reasons for that. If we even take Colonial for the example, if we take Honda, Generally, there's systems that interconnect all these facilities. Generally, there's systems that are being hosted on IT infrastructure, but they're providing critical functionality to OT. Many of those systems shared Active Directory, file shares, all sorts of infrastructure, all connecting these plants. So not most of the time, most of these networks isn't just a single standalone facility. You need to think about an attack taking out several, and that multiplies the impact ginormously. And if you kind of also consider about now, there's questions about whether or not one should pay ransomware, but generally all of the payouts were over $100,000 USD and up to 10 million. But we haven't really talked about something interesting here, because it's not just about your burn rates and all of that, the generation for the cost profit center for cybersecurity. There's also a case where people might actually and will likely move towards bricking and ransoming your embedded systems. And that's going to be a lot more than an 18-day outage to go replace. How many organizations actually have those type of devices on site? Or how many of those devices are actually secure because they're coming from startups or they're a first generation product company? You're going to see lots of stuff starting to change, and there's going to have to be compliance for those devices too. But just to highlight my point, if you take the reasons for why we should do compliance, we have three great examples. NERC in 2017. Well, most of the vulnerabilities that tackle or took over NERC and tackled them to the ground were vulnerabilities that were known for quite some time. They weren't necessarily 0 days, or they could have been prevented with proper hygiene, right? If you didn't need to have RDP everywhere, if you didn't have all your systems all on the same flat network, those were things that could have been avoided if you had been following a lot of the process basics. Yes, there was a 0 day, but in many cases, you could have actually reduced the impact if you had properly segmented and isolated your systems and also prepared for a big rainy day. Again, Norsk Hydro, they had to deal with Locker Goga, and it targeted, again, a bunch of Windows domain credential harvesting. Some of that could have been avoided, but they actually managed to reduce their impacts through various things. But again, it highlights there's a big need for cybersecurity compliance, or maybe not in their case, but in other companies, it would be not as well prepared as Norsk. And then, of course, you had Maersk again, who also got dominated to the curb with NotPetya. So again, if you're going to look at just critical infrastructure, as a case in a hydro dam or something like that, you should also consider this includes pharmaceutical manufacturing lines. This includes the creation of tractors. This creates the creation of cars. All of that are in the crosshairs for ransomware or cybersecurity attacks. And again, proving the need why we need to talk about compliance in a more open fashion. So if you look at the two main ones here that recently happened, you have Colonial Pipeline and Oldsmar Water, and there's been a few others since. But in the Colonial Pipeline, they also entered in through the VPN, and they used the account that was no longer in use. This account should have been locked out if there had been a proper internal compliance, if they had been following the TSA guidelines previous to the updates, if they'd been following all of the other guidelines that have been out for some decades now in some form or shape or form. They weren't using a bunch of the basics to stop the entry into these environments. And 95, 99% of the attackers do enter in through IT infrastructure. Now, someone's going to say, well, why can't we air gap? That's a whole other discussion. And that is a meaningful mechanism in some cases to prevent risk. But the reality is that doesn't work. So again, it's a series of basics and a series of things you need to do depending on where you are in these environments that will help you try to reduce that risk. And in Oldsmar, someone had left TeamViewer on that they thought was not supposed to be in use. And it's a very common thing, especially in low budgeted, low resource environments. And so the software hadn't been used, but should have been removed. If someone had been monitoring that without having to do physical inventorying of all the systems or going on there and crafting through the data through spreadsheets, they probably would have detected that risk and been able to remove it ahead of time. So to try to lead you towards the next piece, those incidents are why we're going to wind up with regulatory response, and we are winding up with regulatory response as a consequence to those incidences. It's going to drive, at least most people think of compliance as drudgery. It's not a fun time usually to be going through audits. It's not fun to collect data and evidence, but there's a reason for it. And what we're trying to do is to try and suggest that there's a better way to do it in a way that's not just a one-time throw money and people at it kind of thing activity that happens once a year. You can use it to do proactive security requirements to reduce your risks overall for something that is inevitable and coming to your environment. So, as I said, governments are reacting with compliance requirements, and that there's no doubt as to reason why they should do so. Recently, in the United States, you had the CMMC requirements for Department of Defense suppliers. So basically, it might not be you that has to deal with the compliance, but it might be you have to deal with your customers' compliance requirements, and then so you get enveloped into that. Then you have things like NERC CIP. So the NERC organization has done various extensions and is actually moving towards including other geographies that contribute to the grid, such as Chile, or even there's similar regulations in Brazil, other countries. The TSA and CISA pipeline audits, right? So they were already always there since after 9/11, but they kind of dropped the ball, and so we're seeing the results of that coming full fold back to us again. You have all sorts of European Union directives. Middle East, again, is doing the same. Canada's pushing the same. And also maritime and operators in aviation looking to the same. But when you think about why they might be doing this, we're winding up in a case where you have significant externalities that are going to be pushing on this: food, energy, water supply, pharma. All of this, these companies being attacked, creates a reasonable rationale for governments to be pushing a minimum level of security for these organizations. But when we say compliance, there's several audiences here. This doesn't just mean you and I, the end consumer. It doesn't mean just the vendor that's integrating and building your products, but it comes from several places. Your suppliers might be included. Your vendors might be included. You have various standards bodies that may or may not be included. You have governments and agencies. And all of that's going to trickle and interact with each other. But between your organization, though, you're not just going to wind up with compliance in one particular place. There's sometimes everyone has internal risk or internal audit groups, but this will affect your procurement. This might affect your legal and compliance, your risk and security team. How about your products? Many organizations that we think are just critical infrastructure actually create products too. So you actually end up wearing both of the hats of being the person that has to abide as the end candidate for an audit, but also being part of making sure that the compliance for other companies that are using your products are also being covered as well. So again, depending on who you are, and depending on what industry you're in, the regulator has several mechanisms in front of them and methods to assess and enforce the compliance. They can rely on controls, self-regulation versus audible requirements. Sometimes they're really flexible, sometimes they're not. Some are risk-based, some are controls, like the CSE now top 18. You have all sorts of mechanisms out there versus IT versus ICS and OT specific. There's often penalty structures. Sometimes you can't do business without it. In some cases, like for example, the payment industry, you have PCI, energy, NERC. All of that is going to be occurring, and it's going to be global, national, even local versus state. And these are all architecture decisions that the regulators will have to enforce upon you, and you're going to have to abide by. But there's good news, and there's good news because if you're already doing a bunch of these control groups or building security programs, whether it's around the NIST CSF framework, or even if you look at the CSCs 20, now 18, there's a bunch of activities that are common across all of them. There's 5 roughly areas in the NIST CSF, and in most cases, if you look at the CMMC, they're very, very tightly correlated to each other. So there's good news if you're already doing it. You can get 2 birds with 1 stone. So here's an example. When someone says compliance, they think of these really nasty spreadsheets. And so also we're setting ourselves up to why you need to do this with technology. But as I said, most of the frameworks, they all align to each other in some way. If you look at the CMMC one, and if I look at the first breakout here, we'll notice that there's a bunch of characters here, AC2, AC3, and those perfectly align with the NIST CSF. That's good news for you because it gives you a good foundation, regardless of, if you have different business units, you can leverage the same things. So the trends are, as a result of all of this, you're going to wind up with increasing audit requirements, and you're going to have to get away from self-assessment and self-reporting, potentially. You're going to have expansion of scope into supply chain. So we need to think about externalities, right? So if you looked at just at a pipeline, well, what else goes through it and what depends on it downstream? It's not just your business that might be affected necessarily from what goes into the logistical machine. You have industry groups becoming more and more proactive. Energy has largely had this, but you might see this in pharmaceuticals and other areas. You'll see expansion of those controls. Maybe sometimes just a high level saying, if do you have a firewall isn't enough. you're going to have multiple firewalls that separate multiple things. Insurers are requiring more and more compliance, at least in alignment with the other standards or even their own internal ones, before you even can have coverage. ICS and OT are also becoming more specific in their standards, like 62443. There's going to become fines, and there's going to be requirements to share information versus hoarding it and obscuring it. So with that being said, though, I'm going to pass that over to John here, who's going to talk about what we've learned over 15 years into NERC CIP. And I'm going to stop my share in one moment. And John, you may take over now. And you're on mute.
So thank you, Ron, appreciate it. And excited to be with everyone today. So I think Ron did a great job of walking us through why compliance and regulatory involvement is going to become a bigger deal. We've had these significant impacts here, just particularly over the last 6 months, but there's been sort of this escalation over time. And what we're seeing is that the regulatory trends, as Ron said, are becoming more and more about very specific guidelines and requiring some form of auditability of those compliance results. I think the TSA example here in the United States, managing the pipelines, is a great example of this, where it was essentially a self-assessment process, and we're already seeing in Washington, D.C. That there will be some very different regulations most likely coming out of CISA and TSA about pipeline regulation being a much more auditable regime. You see the same thing at CMMC for the DoD here. You see it in Chile with their implementation of a similar standard in NERC CIP and around the world. So what can we learn? How do we deal with this? This coming increase in compliance requirements. And so really the rest of the discussion will be about how do you deal with this in an efficient and effective way. So let's start with the starting point. Most OT cybersecurity organizations are early in their journeys. So there are certainly some that are way down the road. This is not to say this is everybody, but we talk to literally hundreds of customers a year. And those customers are I would say 80%, kind of beginning the journey, where network organization manages a lot of the enterprise side of the networking. The INC techs or operations teams, automation teams manage the process control side in many cases. Security manages the perimeter. So maybe they're doing NIDS, they've got a SIM, and if there's a segmentation, they may be monitoring those, but not really monitoring much inside the OT network. And then finally, most of the ICS security, if you think about security management, like patch management, configuration hardening, et cetera, it really is unmanaged for the most part. Or if it is managed, a lot of times it's managed by various OEMs. Who's ever providing the equipment oftentimes is managing that. So now, again, this is not everybody. Lots of folks are further down the path, but this is oftentimes the starting point. And if it's not this, there may be particular pieces of security that have been picked up, or organizations have started down the path of things like the NIST cybersecurity framework or IEC 62443, as Ron mentioned earlier. So as that organization, if you think about that organization starting down a compliance journey, we thought we'd take NERC CIP as an example. NERC CIP has been around for roughly 15 years now. Just for those of you not in the US or North American utility space, we wanted to give you a context, because we're going to use this a bit as a frame of what regulations can be and how organizations have found efficient ways of managing it. So it started in the early 2000s. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is an independent agency of the Department of Energy here in the United States, directs the essentially industry body, NERC, to achieve a set of standards And then that industry body defines those standards, which are then approved by FERC. So back to Ron's chart where he talked about the different ways of a compliance regime being set up. In this case, there was government setting overall rules and direction, and then an industry body came together to sort of make those practical and specific to their industry. That's not that dissimilar. Many regulatory regimes end up similar. And then that group, that industry group, is broken up into several regions. And those regions are really the ones that control the auditing, fines, feedback to the utilities. The compliance regime is focused on reliability overall and included in a series of elements for cybersecurity. Again, this is similar to many of the security compliance regimes that we see. It's not just cybersecurity, it will be a broader set of things, whether it be the RIIO-2 standards in the UK, which is really about pricing in many cases, but it includes cybersecurity elements in that. So oftentimes they're inside other regulatory structures. Over time, those compliance requirements have evolved, I'll call it. So there have been a series of versions of the NERC CIP requirements, and each time clarification is given, and typically additional elements are added to the requirements. So recently here, CIP 13, which is a new requirement, which came out, I'm probably gonna get the exact date wrong, 18 months ago or so, a year ago, and then was implemented last year, is all around supply chain requirements. And so over time, these regulations evolve and change. And so any response to it needs to think about how it's going to evolve to changing requirements. They, in their structure, separate out high and medium assets from low impact assets. In other words, they create different requirements for different types. Again, that will be a common theme, I think, as we see regulations come across, is that there will either be a clear definition of what is a critical asset, or alternatively, they will ask the entity being regulated to define what is critical to them and then secure it. There is very, very rigorous documentation required for these more critical assets. For instance, every change in a configuration must be monitored and tracked. I mean, literally down to a port gets opened, a port shuts. You need to be able to track that. All patches are reviewed every 35 days, and a plan has to be put in place whether they're going to be deployed or not, and if not, how you're going to mitigate it. I could go on and on and on. Every 3 years, organizations get audited, and there's often about a 6-month process of preparation, data collection, review, response, et cetera. And then, there are potentially significant fines, and the penalties are even less the fines than they are the essentially the management reporting to a board of directors that they've been fined and that the government has called them out of compliance. So look, this is a very simple summary of some of the key points. I'm sure that any NERC CIP expert would add 20 additional points to this, but it gives you a sense of the kind of compliance regime. And NERC CIP is a bit at one end of the spectrum. It's a very rigorous, auditable, specific set of controls with not just a letter telling you failed or you have gaps, but true fines. So it's very much at one end, but we think anyway that as these attacks get more and more significant, as the externalities, as Ron mentioned, get more impactful, we are going to see governments push further into compliance regimes that look like NERC CIP, not that are NERC CIP. We're not saying that's going to go across the world, but they're going to be more proactive, I guess, in their requirements. So what are the implications of this for an entity being regulated? Well, the first is organization change. You really have to have a compliance organization specifically around cybersecurity. And that organization often has to have both an IT team and an OT team, and maybe even in the case of NERC CIP, you've got it broken down by business unit. And that requires business behavior process changes literally down at the OT level, the plant level, such as change management or patch management. So there's a significant organizational change that has to occur, which is, by the way, why oftentimes these come in over time, so that the organizations can get a grip with what organizations they need to make that compliance work. Secondly, a lot more what we refer to as OT systems management. So greater requirements for ensuring accurate and up-to-date information on all of your assets, and compliance at the endpoint itself on the asset, such as configuration, compliance, and others. Then there is oftentimes what happens is the organization will design a compliance versus connectivity and connectivity strategy. So oftentimes compliance requirements are less where assets are not connected to a network, because theoretically the risks are less in those environments. And so there's strategies around how do we want to think about connectivity. And there's obviously a balance between, hey, we want to move towards more and more Industry 4.0, data coming out of the facilities, et cetera, being able to do remote control, but that may require a lot of costs for compliance purposes. Not to mention, just securing those systems, but then when you add on the compliance requirements, those costs can go up. And so that needs to be taken into account as we think about some of these more larger digitization efforts. Next, one of the implications is a push to greater automation. As those resource requirements explode, oftentimes over this 15 years, utilities have looked for more and more automation of these compliance tasks. The amount of labor that goes into these things is significant. And then finally, increased costs. It is not possible to do cybersecurity and not add some costs of doing it. And when you add in compliance and all of the reporting requirements, there are increased costs. Now, there is a debate as to whether this particular compliance regime was structured in the greatest balance of effectiveness and efficiency. We're not here to debate that today. The point is that we would argue that over the next 5 years, we are going to see a lot more that look something like this, and therefore organizations need to be ready to deal with the increased costs that are likely a result of that. And it's not just critical infrastructure. Ron, I may have you talk to this because you have been leading a lot of the world's work on embedded device security. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about the devices themselves.
Sure. So as we move towards more compliance for organizations, you might also see at the same time, we are looking towards adding in more certifications and compliance for organizations that are making the devices that we end up using. In Canada, we produced the CSA 200, which targets the guidelines on how you build certain products, not just the product itself, but what does the organization have to do in order to hit certain targets. And those are aligned with ISA 62443. And then if we look at ISA 62443, there's compliance guidance for how does one set up a security management system, how does one do zones and conduits. And then there's also a whole set of requirements there for the products themselves. And you can see, though, that there's several pushes there, even within California, about what does the minimum baseline of security look like for any organization, including municipalities. And that's going to be coming probably into an area near you. You will definitely see it in the United Kingdom with NIS directives, or even in the European Union with the NISA. Singapore is going that way. Japan has adopted more or less the 62443 standards and is converging on them. And then as of recently, you're even seeing big pushes for things like whether it's under NERC CIP for supply chain, but also under Biden's executive order for software bills and materials. And so I kind of jokingly took a picture out of one of Alan Friedman's deck is software bill of materials. They're trying to tell you what's in a product. You'll still need to know kind of what's inside of it and have to make use of that. And technology is definitely going to help you do that. I don't expect any asset owner to know Linux kernel version 2.6.28 is going to be important to them, or 4.3, or which version of OpenSSL. I don't expect them to. but at least you're going to know what's there, and then other tools can take advantage of it. So again, it's coming not just from critical infrastructure, but it's going to come to your home and your smart light bulbs. It's going to come to the really terrible home routers that you get from your internet service provider. It's coming across the board. So don't you worry, it's coming. All right, back to you, John.
Sure, absolutely. So, and Ron, just want to confirm you can still see the screen that I'm sharing.
Yeah, I'm good.
Page 22, terrific. So, so what are the implications of these more rigorous security regimes, whether it be as an operator, meaning a manufacturer, a water company in oil and gas, or someone making one of those products that Ron referred to? The first is auditing and assessment. And so we would expect that there's going to be a much greater need for documentation at essentially all of the endpoints and the network layers. What assets do you have? What software is on those assets? We'll talk more about that. Resources to conduct those mock audits and prepare for assessments. And then after that come responses to the questions that come or the recommendations that come, whether it be, well, you're not doing these, it's not finable, but we recommend before our next audit, you do the following things. OT systems management, as I mentioned, compliance and connectivity strategy. So that making those trade-offs that we talk about. What we refer to as intelligent influence. There will be the opportunity and most likely the need for organizations to shape this regulatory environment. In the case of NERC CIP, obviously NERC was an industry body that was shaping it, and then individual entities were engaged in that group and could possibly, not always, but at least can maybe shape things in certain ways. And so this will likely be a desire from most organizations to try to be involved in what that regulation is going to be. And then finally, board level involvement. For many organizations, OT security has not been the #1 thing for their board of directors. Cybersecurity certainly has been, but in many organizations, OT wasn't the first thing. Again, that's more of a general statement. There are certainly those that have been, but there is no question over the last year, we have seen that change dramatically. Boards of directors are now asking, am I applying the same standards in OT that I do in IT? These are my critical assets. What am I doing to protect them? And certainly when compliance comes to the table, the board and the audit committee become really, really important. So these are some of the implications that we see, which will drive labor, increased action on managing assets, and then also the reporting. And so, if you look at one example of the CMMC, so CMMC is the, as we mentioned before, it's essentially the standard that the United States Department of Defense has created. It's a maturity, it's actually not officially a standard, to be clear. It is a maturity model that DoD suppliers will need to achieve different levels of, depending on what their contract requires. But as we get into it, what you see is that, again, to this point of managing and active OT systems management, a lot of these things are around controlling endpoints, controlling software. So control and monitor user installed software, establish and enforce particular security configurations, apply essentially a blacklisting policy on software. And we could go on. The point is, and this is just one example of one of these emerging regulatory frameworks, maturity models, where you're seeing more and more a requirement to manage those OT systems in a more aggressive and holistic way. And so, given all of these requirements, what have successful organizations done? What have we seen companies do that have found a way to do this as effectively and efficiently as they can? And I'm going to start at the top there. So the first is dedicating expert resources at a leadership level. And I think one of the things that we see these companies do is they say, look, this is important enough for us that we're going to pull really good leaders out of the OT world out of running a plant or things like that, and we're going to put them into this compliance and security requirements. Number two, bringing in qualified expertise. So finding third parties that can help or bringing in new talent who have lived through this in other geographies or in other industries. They consolidate, centralize, and automate. And what we mean by this is bringing the tools, the information, and the people together in a way that allows you to consolidate the data, consolidate and centralize the analysis and reporting, as well as the actions that you're going to need to take to maintain compliance and security, and then automate as much as possible. Balancing compliance with operational needs. And what we mean by this is this trade-off of trying to put the right architecture, network architectures and others in place where you can decide, okay, operationally I want to do this, but that's going to require compliance. Okay, how do I make those trade-offs? Getting a group so that you can share and learn from others, participating in these regulatory bodies. So those that have been successful have been able to both learn and make sure they really understand the rules, but also potentially even shape some of the way this world moves. A lot of communication. So one of the things that I don't think people realize until they get into one of these, start to deal with compliance, is the amount of upwards communication that is all of a sudden required. The board wants to understand exactly what's going on. And so there's a lot more upwards and interaction between OT management teams and boards and senior teams. And then lastly, building a really strong foundation of asset visibility and management. That is the foundation around which all of this happens. Now, the great news is, Ron mentioned this before, even if your organization does not have a NERC CIP type compliance regime or CMMC or RIO2 or any of these, even if it doesn't, and you see this coming down the road, the great news is a lot of the things you're going to go do to achieve security, cybersecurity against certain frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework and others, help you build and get ready for this, right? So you can get a running start at a lot of this. I mean, if you're, regardless of compliance, if you're trying to do cybersecurity well, a lot of these things hold true as well. You still want to have expert resources. You still want to consolidate and automate. You still want to build that foundation of asset visibility. So there's a running start that you can get by focusing on cybersecurity, that when the regulations come, you're much better able to deal with those compliance requirements. So specifically, how do we think about doing those things? How do we think about automating and centralizing, managing assets, et cetera, in a way that does that efficiently and effectively? So first, we want to highlight this point around OT systems management. This is security in our view, and particularly compliance is all about OT systems management. The active administration of operating technology systems. And those functional elements includes things like asset inventory, vulnerability and patch management, network and system design, et cetera. And these are processes that, if you look at them, they've been applied to IT for a long time. It just happens that in most organizations, these things aren't rigorously applied on the OT side. And so this is about bringing those same kind of capabilities into the OT world. Our view is, and clearly we've built a company around this. Our view is you really need to have an integrated platform to do that. And that starts with the asset inventory. It starts with, as I mentioned, that rigorous view of all of the assets and thousands of pieces of information about those assets. Because with that, you build your database for security and for eventual compliance. That asset inventory then becomes your foundation to do things like vulnerability management, patch management, configuration management. By gathering that rich asset inventory, you know every user and account on your system, not just the ones that are communicating, but all the dormant ones, the ones that, frankly, from a security point of view, offer significant threats because those passwords may have been leaked on the dark web. A lot of these recent attacks have been through that user and account management. Well, from a compliance point of view, you also need to manage those things. That asset inventory, rich asset inventory, allows you to do that user and account management. You're going to need some form of anti-malware, almost certainly, whether that be whitelisting or next-gen AV, et cetera. The ability to integrate that data to be able to, A, secure yourself, but also B, prove that you're secure, i.e. prove that your whitelisting is in lockdown, and prove that new software isn't getting loaded on your system without you knowing it. No question, that will require intrusion detection, both from a security point of view as well as from compliance. And so being able to log assets that can log, being able to detect things like failed logins and new users and much more advanced intrusion detection capabilities. And then finally, on the incident response side, that asset inventory allows you to build out those processes for incident response, whether it be monitoring backups. No question, in compliance regimes, they're going to require you to be able to monitor your backup status. But from a security point of view, the ability to pivot around all of that asset information to respond to things more quickly, to do tabletop exercises, which are almost always a part of these compliance regimes. And so our strong feeling is that you need to start with at the beginning with this platform, and that platform needs to start at its core with the most robust asset inventory you can have that allows you to build these additional pieces. And then that platform, that OTSM platform, then needs to fit into a broader IT security management architecture. In almost every organization we see, there is already an IT security management program ongoing. And so whatever that program looks like, your OTSM platform needs to easily fit into it, whether it be feeding into a CMDB. Many of our clients have enterprise risk platforms that are managing their broader security compliance, or frankly, compliance outside security. And so this platform needs to integrate with those. And for instance, our Verve platform integrates with dozens and dozens of different of these IT tools because it has to be able to link to that enterprise set of solutions. Otherwise, you end up with these two different, or frankly, in many cases, we've seen dozens of different tools that people are trying to pull data from. None of the data matches, et cetera. So again, key to have a platform that builds that OT asset inventory, allows you to OTSM, and then integrates with the broader IT security management capabilities. So what's that going to look like, right? Well, that's going to look like having that deep asset visibility. One of the things that we often hear in this compliance discussion is, oh, well, I need to know how many devices I have with a certain version of firmware at the following site. Well, okay, you got to have a platform that can pull that quickly, that can pull, okay, what are the various devices by OS, that can pull it by manufacturer or subclass. Also, one of the things that is almost always required is to be able to define your critical assets versus those that are less critical or out of scope. And so being able to quickly find those high criticality assets in your environment. So just a set of, the platform needs to give you the ability to have these different views of those assets so that you can pull that data up and be able to share that with an auditor or frankly with people internal. Once that data on the assets and particularly software, OS versions, et cetera, is there, you can then start to identify vulnerabilities. I think one of the things that we've seen clients most struggle with in these OT environments is getting accurate vulnerability information on a real-time basis. You can't scan these environments with a Nessus scanner or a Rapid7 scanner because you'll trip the plant, you'll knock over a PLC, et cetera. And so you have to find a way to do vulnerability management without scanning. Some people have chosen to try to do that with network monitoring tools where they'll track the flows through the network to be able to do deep packet inspection. The problem with that is it misses all of the actual OS versions, and you normally can't pick up application software that's running and patch status through what's on the wire. So what you need is some solution, and obviously Verve offers such a thing, but our view is you need some solution that's going to get you that detailed information on vulnerabilities all the way down to what patches are deployed, on the OSs, all the firmware, et cetera, because that's going to be a critical part of your compliance regime. And then one of the key things in most of these is the ability to track patching. And in IT, in some ways, it's a relatively straightforward process. In OT, this is often very difficult because in many cases, different OEMs are patching these systems, or alternatively, where we've got manual processes. By gathering this into a single database and automating it, you then can start to track things like, all right, how many missing patches do I have that are older than a certain time frame? In NERC CIP, it needs to be done within 35 days. Different regulatory regimes will have different standards for that. But the ability to do that, and then the ability to track it by type of patch. Is it a security patch? Is it not security? It's just a critical update, but it's not a security. And then by group, et cetera. The ability to have this data at your fingertips when you have to go through an audit, or when boards of directors are asking for it, et cetera, is key to compliance. Now, again, we've been talking about compliance here today. It's obviously also key for security, right? The ability to automate your patch process significantly improves the overall cybersecurity of the organization. I mentioned before, users and accounts. A key part of every compliance regime is to be able to manage users. Our view is you got to, again, bring that into a central database where you can be able to know all of the various users on all of your systems. Do you have new users? Do you have administrator accounts that shouldn't be there? By the way, this is also, from a security point of view, one of the biggest risks in the OT environment, because so many OT infrastructures are not managed through some OT Active Directory type system. And so these are the reasons things like Oldsmar and Colonial Pipeline can happen. So I could keep going here in different types of things that need to be in this platform. This is things around logging and ensuring that devices are logging, being able to monitor most active users, how devices are being accessed, et cetera. All of these requirements, including configuration status, I mentioned that this is almost always a key part of any compliance regime, is to be able to track, to ensure that your devices are compliant with a set of rigorous configuration compliance standards. At Verve, we've built an OT specific configuration compliance management capability that maps up to things like DISA, STIG, and others. But importantly, it's also flexible. If a company says, look, these are our standards that we want to track, the tool, whatever you use, needs to be flexible enough to be able to input your particular choices around compliance. So I'm going to end the discussion around some of the data that needs to be in your platform, but these are the kinds of things that we see need to be in there. And the value of this, back to the discussion around the trends and what successful organizations are doing around compliance is, number one, it lowers your labor costs. By centralizing all of this, you can significantly reduce the number of compliance and or security personnel you need. So you're not having to have people at each site manage their compliance, right? You're pulling that up at a higher level. Secondly, whatever you use has to be operationally safe. And this approach has been proven for 15 years or so on all the various OT and OEM systems. It needs to, whatever you use needs to give that deep asset visibility without having to scan, have hardware, rely on packets that may or may not have the information you need. It needs to be certain data. It allows you to do better risk management. So regardless of the compliance part, it needs to also drive security. And having this comprehensive view from a compliance point of view actually increases your security, because you really do get a 360-degree view of the risk that might be present on the assets. And then finally, this approach also allows you to very quickly fix things, to remediate things, whether that be a gap in your compliance. So for instance, I've got new users on a device, they shouldn't be there, I can quickly go and remove them. I've got a new piece of software that got installed, that software shouldn't be there, I can remove it. Not only helps from a compliance point of view, but when you do get that threat indicator from a security point of view, you see an alert come up from our SIM that says there is a threat possibility here, you can then quickly take remediating actions like closing a port, removing a user, shutting down a system. That ability to do that rapid response is key from both a compliance as well as a security point of view. And this is, the way we think about eventually an organization is going to want to structure their compliance organization. You're going to want to be able to what we call think global, but act local, meaning scale and automate the prioritization, prioritization, the visibility of your compliance status all up into a single database where you can see it all. But then as you start to think about taking actions, automating those actions for the local plant or operations personnel to be able to execute, because you certainly don't want somebody patching a system from 5,000 miles away, not knowing about certain criticalities of devices or what the plant schedule is, et cetera. And so, or if that particular patch may cause an issue with that application, you want to be able to be there to fix it. And so this idea of being able to get all that data centrally, do compliance reporting, do security analysis, et cetera, and then drive those actions locally. So in summary here today, 4 key points. So number 1, compliance and legislation is inevitable. We think this is coming and it's going to be quite significant. Number 2, that compliance does not need to be bureaucratic. It can be automated. There's a lot of things you can do to basically reduce the cost and complexity of this. We showed a little bit of that today. In fact, those regulatory bodies can actually help you drive security results by being the driver and the instigation to go and start building OTSM capabilities. As I said, if you start down a security journey around NIST or CIS, et cetera, a lot of these things come. OTSM is part of that, and that allows you to be compliant down the road. And that's really, the last point, compliance is crucial when determining maturity. So, it's compliance really is the beginning of this broader cybersecurity journey that you will have in the overall organization. So with that, let me end our formal presentation. There's a few questions, and so Ron and I will take a few minutes to answer some questions. And obviously, if you want to reach us, our information is up here, and then we've got the information for our next webinar here at the bottom of the page. I know we've had a few questions come in. I'm going to answer a couple, and then Ron, maybe I'll ask you to answer a couple. So one of the questions that came in was around how do you do automated asset management or discovery. The way that we do it is with a 2-part effort. We use a passive client-based approach on all of the Windows, Unix, Linux machines. And that allows us to gather literally thousands of pieces of information about those devices passively. Not through the network, to be clear, but on the device itself. And then for the embedded devices, so think of your PLCs, your relays, et cetera, Verve has built a capability to reach out to each of those assets in their native protocols to be able to gather back key information, make, model, firmware, configuration settings, et cetera, so that we can provide both asset visibility, but also things like vulnerability information, et cetera, because we have the data on on firmware that you would need to be able to match to vulnerabilities. Ron, any questions that you've gotten on your end?
No. So I actually was typing a quite lengthy one to Ed that
Ah,
was
okay,
coming in,
okay.
and accidentally pressed cancel. So that's on me. But so his question was, does your platform require connections to the internet? So this is a twofold question. And then regarding patching, how do you know which patch is approved by ICS vendors? So I'll break that up into two pieces. The first part is our platform doesn't require internet to be executed at the site level, but there is advantages to having connectivity, even if it's a one-way stream. So many of our customers have data diodes or are separated for various reasons, such as a very, very low bandwidth connections out to a windmill farm, right? This is a good example. We're talking about almost dial-up levels of connectivity. There is a lot of advantages to having data flowing upwards in one stream into a globalized reporting platform. So that's why we do suggest that sites do have connectivity, at least for a one-way stream. But you can take care of all of the actions at the local level on the site and probably find another way to get that data into the global platform. So yes, you can do so without internet. And you can also get patch lists and all of your updates to the site through alternative means, although there's risks with that too. Regarding the patching, there's multiple ways to build lists around how do you know which patch is approved. There's the general patches, which you may or may not want to apply depending on the orientation of the systems and the customizations that the vendors have provided on it. For example, a system that might be running an Emerson Ovation DCS environment that has certain types of failover NICs, well, you might want to treat that a little bit differently than, say, the box that's controlling the printers for part of your MES. You can deal it from generic perspectives, or you can create specialized lists based on the vendors, or we can work with you on building those lists out so you don't have to do it in multiple ways. So you can do that through your vendor partnerships and providing us the data, or through our services team. There's many ways to do it, but the platform's flexible to handle the whitelisting and the denial or the acceptance of certain patches or not, depending on even which particular systems too. So yeah, we definitely can
Thank
do
you.
it. It's just a question of.
I'm just going to address one more question that came in before the session, which is what are the common regulatory failures that you need to watch out for? I think the biggest one we have seen is the not planning ahead for what's coming. So what we've seen some large organizations do is the first set of regulations come out and they scramble to try and address those. And they put together a team, they talk to their vendors, and they put something together that gets them over the hump of that first bit of compliance requirements. Typically, it's a relatively low upfront investment, and it's oftentimes a more manual process. None of these compliance regimes ever go backwards, meaning it never gets easier. Every one of these, and this, by the way, isn't just true for OT cybersecurity compliance. If you look at compliance for safety, for environmental, et cetera, the first part is always the beginning, and then new things get added over time. I think the biggest failure people make is not biting the bullet, I'll call it, and thinking ahead of, okay, what's likely to come here? What's happened in other compliance environments and security environments? So let's build something that's going to work over time rather than just responding quickly and late in many cases to what the request was. Let's get in front of this thing. By the way, you can get in front of it right now, even if you're not within a compliance structure, by going and starting to pursue things like the CIS top 18 now, or the NIST CSF, right? By doing that, you start to get ahead of any compliance requirements that are come. They're going to have those elements somewhere in them. So I think the biggest thing we've seen is failure to think longer term about where it's going and build the processes, the technologies, the platforms, et cetera, that you're going to need for 5 years from now, not just what you think you need for the first year. So with that, I know we're a little bit over. So thank you all very much for joining us today. As you can see on the bottom, we'll be doing another webinar around MDR on August 31st. OT MDR is a very challenging topic, so we look forward to sharing some of our learnings from that with everyone. And again, this this recording, and the document will be sent out via email here a little bit later today. I hope everybody has a great day. And Ron, thank you for being with me today. And take care. Look forward to seeing you all soon.